Mrs. Bradley here, and this particular instructional video will be dealing with the Explain 2 Consequences question that features on the American West section of Paper 2. Firstly, I'd like you to consider, what is the difference between a cause and a consequence? Pause this video and have a minute to think. Here we have a straightforward example for you to understand the difference between cause and consequence. If you do not do your homework, you will receive a demerit. That is a consequence of you not doing your homework. The reason for this, however, is because the school's policy is that if you don't do homework, then you will receive a demerit. That is the cause of your demerit, as well as you not doing your homework. We're going to have a look at and work through an example of this question together. The question here is explain 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty 1851. The consequences question is worth 8 marks, and you should spend no longer than 12 minutes on this question. It is important to consider the mark scheme before we embark upon this question. Each consequence that you write about separately is worth 4 marks. This mark scheme applies to each of the consequences you write about and will total 8 in the end. As you can see, for level 1, if you give a general comment about a consequence and give some general information, you can earn up to 1 to 2 marks for each consequence. For level 2, if you are actually analysing and explaining the consequence, giving specific information to support your explanation, you can earn 3 to 4 marks per consequence. For the purpose of this presentation, I have included information that you could include for this question to explain the consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty. If we look up to our top left, we can see that there is an increased settlement in the West as a result of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Because settlers going on the Oregon Trail were guaranteed safety by the Indians for a money fee that they would receive at the end of each year from the government, 250,000 travellers were able to follow trails with only 400 killed. If we look to our top right, we can see there was actually a period of peace between the Indian Nation settlers and soldiers, with only 2 outbreaks of fighting in the 20 years between 1840 and 1860, and even these were ended fairly quickly with some form of peace being established. As we can see in the bottom left, the Indian way of life was jeopardised in many ways as a result of this treaty. The road and houses being built disrupted the Indian hunting grounds. The Indian nations themselves didn't agree with the treaty as they believed they were warriors not bound by it. They had also begun to rely on annual payouts from the government for food and supplies, slowly beginning to lose their independence. More importantly, this was the first step towards a reservation system for the Indian nations. Lastly, you could include the resentment that built up amongst the Indian nations after the government refused to adhere to the treaty. After the discovery of gold in 1858, the Colorado Gold Rush meant that miners and settlers were pouring into Colorado, but this was the area and territory belonging to the Sioux and the Cheyenne. This breached the treaty, but the US government did nothing. Now that we know of some consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851, we only need to talk about 2 of them. Each will be a separate paragraph. This is a very simple structure for you to follow. For each paragraph, you need to state the consequence in a sentence and then add supporting detail and knowledge that will prove this consequence. Again, with the second one, state the consequence in a sentence and then add details that will support this. You can add connectors that will help you to focus on the question and emphasize the consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty. If you look up in the top right, you are able to see consequence connectives that will help you to elaborate and emphasize the consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty. As a result, this meant that, consequently. All these will help you to stress and emphasize analysis in your writing. Here we have an example of a model answer. As you can see, it's broken down into 2 sections. In your writing, this would be 1 paragraph and this would be another. But we've broken it down to stating the consequence and explain to show you what needs to be done. Here you can see that consequence 1 is stated, and then we have the supporting evidence. The first consequence given is that it led to increased settlement of the West. The supporting evidence here is given. This was because in return for an annuity, the Plains Indians had guaranteed that travellers could use the Oregon Trail safely. As a result of this, we have evidence to support it. Only 400 were killed out of 250,000 travellers that followed the trails between 1840 and 1860. The second paragraph follows the same pattern as the first. It gives us a point, a consequence of the treaty, and supporting evidence. In this case, it argues that the Plains Indians' way of life was undermined as a consequence of the treaty. Here they talk of building new roads and forts that disrupts Indian hunting grounds and lands, the Indians becoming dependent on the money provided by the government, so becoming less independent, and more importantly, this becoming the first step towards official reservations. If you look at the mark scheme, we can understand why this answer receives the full 8 marks. If you look at what you need for level 2, you need to look at features of the period and analyse them to explain a consequence. You need specific information about the topic to add supported explanation and show good knowledge and understanding of the period. If you look at each of these paragraphs, you can see each one specifically outlines a consequence of the treaty, then gives supporting information and knowledge that explains the consequence. It is done in both paragraphs to a degree that it achieves 8 marks. This is a mark scheme provided by the exam board related to the question that we've been looking at. It's important to note these 2 AOs here. Each one relates to the skills that they are looking for in this question. AO1 is your knowledge and understanding of the period. AO2 relates to your understanding and ability to express consequence, explaining it. Remember that each consequence and explanation will be marked separately out of 4 marks, and you will have a total of 8 in the end. The examiner will always be given some relevant points that you may be able to include, but if anything you include is relevant, they will mark it positively. Each of these points on their own are not enough though, they need to be developed into a paragraph that explains how they are a consequence.